I want to welcome you to University of Verne's Cultural Natural History Collection's Influential Voices Speaker Series. This is where we highlight the work of cultural influencers, thought leaders, humanitarians, and those who work for social justice. For today, though, we are welcoming Dr. Nawang Phuntsog, sorry if I mispronounced your name, I'm so sorry, in a conversation with Ann Collier, I think I got your name, who is our curator. And they will be talking about the drive to keep Tibetan culture alive. We also have a special welcome to Nawang's wife, Seki. Thank you for joining us today. As the university's museum, the Cultural Natural History Collections runs solely on the generosity of donations and soft monies. So if you want to donate, there's going to be a link in the chat. There's also a link that was printed on your ticket, and we would truly appreciate your support. So one last comment for those of you on Zoom. If you do have a question for Nawang, please put it into the chat. We've received some questions already. We will also have questions coming from the audience. We hope you are on campus today. And we do hope to get to all of your questions, time permitting. So let's go ahead and begin. So please welcome Nawang and our conversation guide, Ann. But let me tell you a little bit about Nawang. Nawang is a professor emeritus of education in the Department of Elementary and Bilingual Education at Cal State Fullerton. When he was a Fulbright Narrow Research Scholar to India, he explored the intersection of compassion-based inner values, which are secular ethics. Also, the middle way approach for resolving the Sino-Tibetan issue, and compassion Tibetan nationalism in the exile schooling process. He is widely published in several peer-reviewed journals, including the International Journal of Multilingualism, the Tibetan Diaspora, Indigenous and Migrant Education, and Intercultural Education. So with that, Ann, it's your turn now. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Felicia.
Oops.
Your title has a lot of syllables. You have a lot of syllables. So, welcome everybody who's here in person and on Zoom. As introduced, this is Dr. Nawang B. Phuntsog. And Nawang is a Tibetan exile. He was born in Tibet and is now in the United States and is an educator on the plight and on the country itself, or exiled country of Tibet. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into a little bit of the background on so people understand why there is a Tibetan issue and why they're in exile. So if you can explain that.
First of all, I'd like to thank Cultural and Natural History program of this campus for inviting me. And to be very honest with you, I feel a little nervous to be part of this Influential Voices series lecture kind of program here. But I'm truly delighted to be here with you this morning. And also, this is my first time after the pandemic lockdown to be in a face-to-face situation like this. And I must say, I feel very, it's very refreshing to be in this kind of a context, particularly in a university context like this. So I want to thank all of you for inviting me to this wonderful program. And I just want to make one point very clear at this point. I'm not representing any organization at this point. I'm just speaking for myself as a Tibetan American academician. And so, I'll be sharing with you my observations, personal observations with regard to the Tibetan diaspora situation. And so, I just want this to be very clear so that people will not really misunderstand me and then generalize my statements to all these other situations and make it very kind of like, complicated. So I hope that will not happen. So
everything you're saying, I think the thing is that I'm not sure if a lot of students understand what's going on with Tibet. So let's go into that and why there's an autonomous region for Tibetans, but Tibetans are in exile in other countries.
Right. Okay.
And explain that part, and then we'll go into the refugee situation, etc. But I think if we explain just the background of why there's an issue.
So, Communist China invaded and occupied Tibet in 1940s and continued till about early 1950s. They kind of like slowly trickled into Tibet. And before that, Tibet existed as a free country with its own language, its own political system, with its own customs, a very unique, language indeed, and has its own currency. And in fact, I can show you a currency which I carry in my pocket. If you're wondering what Tibetan currency looks like, it's here. It's old. I carry this all the time in my pocket. Here, this is the Tibetan currency, which clearly shows that Tibet was indeed a free, independent country. So then China invaded and really destroyed thousands of Tibetan monasteries, killed millions. The estimate is 1.2 million Tibetans were killed as a result of Chinese occupation. And then things became so unbearable for Tibetans, and they thought it's better to leave their own country and go to exile. So the nearest country, of course, is India, and so India and Tibet has had this long-term, relationship in the past, and so we fled into India, including His Holiness, and so that's why Tibet exists in two situations. One, Tibet. In Tibet itself, under the Chinese occupation, there is this autonomous region of Tibet. It's called Tar. And then we have Tibetans living in exile like myself, including His Holiness. And over, I would say, 150,000 Tibetans live in exile. So we have a very robust kind of like diaspora establishment with schools and with our own parliamentary system, democratic system in exile in India. And I'm sure we'll get to that situation a little later. That's how, we have this Tibet existing in two different contexts. One, Tibet, Tibetans living under the Chinese occupation. And then Tibetans in exile, those who had left Tibet, and they are hoping to leave Tibet, actually speaking, because so much oppression taking place in Tibet. But then it has become so very difficult to leave Tibet. First of all, Tibetans are denied, passport to leave their own country. And then there is this high-tech surveillance taking place all over these border areas of Tibet and India. And so it has become almost impossible these days for the Tibetans to flee their country and take refuge in India or elsewhere. So this is really a very disturbing, very difficult situation for Tibetans in Tibet. They aren't able to leave their country, nor can they practice their own religion, nor can they use their own language, which is their mother tongue, to be able to use in their own country. Can you imagine? It's such a difficult, tragic situation that is taking place in Tibet.
Let's back up a little bit. So you've mentioned His Holiness.
Mm-hmm.
Let's explain who His Holiness is for people who don't know.
The Dalai Lama is an institution in Tibet. We have had 13 Dalai Lamas in the past, and now we have the current 14th Dalai Lama who is living in exile.
And the Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader.
Spiritual
of the
and
Tibetans.
used to be a temporal leader as well of Tibet until Tibet was invaded and occupied by China in 1940s, and then he fled, of course. And His Holiness is actually reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara, which is the god of compassion. And so Tibet is supposed to be the country that is, ruled, or should I say, in fact, governed really lovingly and joyfully by, all these, reincarnations of Dalai Lama. So right now, the 14th is that, Dalai Lama.
And then to put into context what's going on with Ukraine right now, Russia wants the Ukrainians to be Ukrainian. The Ukrainians want to remain Middle European
Mm-hmm.
or Eastern European. So Russians trying to take away their culture, their identity, their country, their lifestyle. That's what happened with Tibet when China came in. China came in and took away their country, their lifestyle, their culture, and their government. So it is said that the Tibetan refugee program is the most successful refugee program in the world. And I'm assuming, you could explain, but that's probably because their entire government, when they left in 1951,
51.
when they left in 1951, the entire government went with them. So imagine we have a refugee program process throughout the world. There's refugees that are coming from so many different countries, but they don't normally come with their government. They don't come with their system already set up with them. So India, we'll talk about that, accepted the Tibetans into their country. Other countries did too, but the majority, the Dalai Lama, the government, all came over to India. And if you think about it, they've been there since 1951. We've got 3-4 generations going of these people that are living, the Tibetans that are living in India, but still identify as Tibetan. So let's go into why India was so receptive to Tibet. Like, we know there's countries out there that aren't really receptive to refugees coming in. So why was India so receptive to Tibetans coming in?
First of all, India and Tibet has had this long historical relationship. Tibetan Buddhism, which actually is just Buddhism in essence, really came from India. And then Tibetan kings in the past invited several scholars from India to help disseminate Buddhism in Tibet. So, this has been going on for a long, long time in the past. And even our Tibetan language actually came from Sanskrit. So Tibetan language has very close relationship with Sanskrit. If you look at the letters of alphabet, they're very, very similar. Pronunciation is almost identical. But then, our one minister in the 7th, 6th century, he developed the Tibetan calligraphy, Tibetan language, very unique to the Tibetan situation. And later he invited scholars from India to translate Buddhism into Tibetan language. Now, a lot of the Buddhist texts that do not exist in India, they exist in Tibetan language because the translation was done in such accurate manner in, I would say, 11th, 12th century. Really, you can easily, translate back into Sanskrit or Hindi language, for example. So that is one, and then of course India, borders Tibet. So it was a little easier for Tibetans to cross the border through Bhutan.
But let's talk about that border. Okay. It was, you got Himalayans.
Right.
So did you cross on foot? Like you as a child, didn't you?
Well, again, it's a very long range border area between Tibet and India, and so there are actually areas where you don't have to really climb Mount Everest. It's really low, sort of like ranges,
What's
close to Darjeeling. I would say 10,000
Okay,
feet.
go on.
Very high indeed, of course. My parents actually left through Bhutan, which is also a border, area of Tibet. So it was easy for my parents to cross the, border into Bhutan. We lived there maybe a year or so, and then eventually, when His Holiness, took political asylum in India, so they decided to leave Bhutan and move to India.
All right, so I don't want to jump too far ahead, but isn't there an issue now with Bhutan and India and Tibet?
Well, Bhutan is now an independent country, has very strong relationships with many other countries. And India, because it borders India, so India has definitely some interest in Bhutan. But Bhutan is really an independent country with its own currency, with its own, government. Actually, the head of the government is actually the king, but he's like, Queen of England type of situation. And they have this gross national happiness kind of a concept, which actually many countries in the West, they try to emulate. So Bhutan is a very unique, beautiful country. I visited actually in 2013, and I was so impressed. There, what I call car license plates are all written in Tibetan, Bhutanese language, and they dress up in their national, costume. And if you were to visit a Bhutanese, like Buddhist temple, you must put on the Bhutanese, national garb, the dress, in order for you to be able to visit. So it's really they try to really promote their culture, and And of course, again, since it borders Tibet, China is really, again, trying to, infiltrate into Bhutan, which is, again, very disturbing. It's not letting this independent, beautiful country to exist. It's bothering Bhutan every now and then, because of this border incursion, that China engages in, like they would do frequently with, border with India, for example. So, nowadays there's a lot of consciousness, awareness in India that people should be really calling the border between Tibet and India as border between Tibet and India, rather than India and China. Because then you're kind of like sending these mixed messages. So there's a lot of consciousness in India. I was really very impressed because in the past I wouldn't see a lot of this kind of awareness, but these days a lot of Indian politicians, regular Indian folks are taking such a keen interest on Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan political issue, border issue, because they truly understand. And there was never a border issue when Tibet was an independent country. As soon as China took over Tibet, then this became a huge, border issue, and India is spending, really, a lot of money to protect its border, which is very huge, long. It's not a, small area.
So when you're talking about that, when Nepal entered into the United Nations, they cited that Tibet was an independent country they worked with. And then Bhutan is an independent country with their own currency, their own government.
Right.
Tibet was an independent country with its own currency, script, government.
Right.
Why didn't Tibet last? Why isn't Nepal gets to stay, Bhutan is now growing, but Tibet is so, what is it about Tibetan that you think? Well,
really, Tibet was caught in this really worse geopolitical situation. A lot of these other countries had interest in Tibet, including British India, Mongols, China. And then, of course, World War I and II, and they took place. And of course, Tibet is also a very isolated country. Many, countries, didn't have a lot of should I say, economic or otherwise interest in Tibet. And then, Tibet is a strategically very important country. It is the roof of the world. A lot of, important rivers originate from Tibet. And Tibet has very, very rich mineral resources. The lot of lithium battery that you use in your cell phone actually comes from Tibet. 70% of the world lithium comes from Tibet. So China had this kind of a intention, deliberate, to invade Tibet. So that they would have access to the mineral resources, and not only that, then they would be able to annex other countries easily, like Bhutan, Nepal, and stuff like that. So Tibet kind of was more or less, due to all this geopolitical situation, was presented like a victim on a plate. It was so easy for China to swallow up Tibet. Tibet did not have a very strong military presence in its own country. It was a very peace-loving country. When China threatened, Tibetan government then tried to negotiate through a peaceful means. And they were, actually to some extent, the Chinese, politicians proved to be very deceptive. They did not really abide by the promises they made to the Tibetans. So Tibetans trusted the Chinese, thinking that they will let the Tibetans practice their own religion, use their own language, have their own political system in place, which they promised, but they never kept the promise. And so so it's really a tragic kind of story situation that a peaceful country with its own culture, language, religion was just allowed to be taken up, eaten up, gobbled up by a country with military power, and now, of course, China has become so economically powerful. It uses its economic power, in fact, to suppress, Tibetan religion, Tibetan language, and so it's just it has become more difficult. China, in fact, Tibet actually is very surprisingly has become more isolated, more difficult to travel than it was in the past before, communist China took over Tibet. Tibet was a very isolated country, but now it has become even more isolated. You can't go to Tibet freely these days. There is total lack of access for media people or for anyone if you're interested to go to Tibet. So since Anne brought up this Ukraine situation, I thought I'd just share this with you, my observation. Of course, human suffering is just so terrible that's taking place in Ukraine. But at least, the media has access to Ukraine. So you and I are able to get real-time atrocities committed by the Russian, invading military forces. And so, I think that's at least a good news. It's able to get international support, because of this media access and, media really, giving us almost real time. Of course, it's so horrendous to watch this suffering, that is taking place in Ukraine. And I just want to, highlight one element. We know, Ukrainian people are being killed. Their infrastructure is being destroyed. Decimated, really, unnecessarily. But at the same time, I think we need to keep in mind there are animals that are suffering so much. Dogs, birds, cows, insects. Really, I think, we don't think suffering of this particular, non-human group. So I think we need to keep that in mind too. It's not the human suffering, but like this bird singing so beautifully in the morning, they are being killed. Of course, there's no report, but my hunch is, because they're just bombing. So I'm sure, so that is, at least I'm so happy that there is international attention. There's media access. So we do know, the atrocities, committed by Russia. And so, really, it's kind of shocking, particularly living in this 21st century, that that Russians would not allow the Ukrainian people's aspirations to live in a free, peaceful country of their own choice. Why would they be subjected to this kind of
resources,
subjugation, torture, and it really, makes me so unhappy, so sad that so much suffering is taking place right in front of us. Yet this powerful nation still is like,
Well,
yeah.
You were talking about the media. We have access to the media, but during the Cultural Revolution in China, under Mao Zedong's party, the numbers are for Tibetans that it was 250 million during the whole Cultural Revolution of China. There was 250 million deaths, up to 20 million. That's how far apart and how the numbers are, that we don't have the true numbers because they didn't have the media in there. So when you're talking about now we know what's going on in Ukraine, we can get real life information.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Russia's not getting real life information. They're getting
That's
a
true.
different side of it. But back to the Cultural Revolution that happened in China, to get rid of the culture, to get rid of all different cultures, to get rid of all different religions so that everybody will assimilate into one mind, one thought process. They took over the palaces, they took over your area, but yet now that's open for tourism. So we've got disparate numbers on how many people actually died during the revolution to change this, but yet now they're selling tickets for people to come and see how someone once lived. Mm-hmm. How does that feel for Tibetans to know there's like an affront to that it's...
Well, definitely I would say the Chinese communist regime is very opportunistic. If the religion benefits the communist ideology in some ways, they will use it, you know, like making money and things like that. So since you brought up this Cultural Revolution, during Cultural Revolution, you know, really they estimate is 30 million Chinese were killed, whereas 1.2 million Tibetans died as a result of this Cultural Revolution that spanned around 20 years. The worst period was between 1966 and 1978, the worst period of Cultural Revolution. And Tibetans suffered the most because they were, you know, like distinctly different from the Han Chinese in terms of language, culture, religion. So they suffered so much. There was one French scholar who visited Tibet 4 times in 1980s. And she made this rough estimate that 95% of Tibet's cultural heritage was destroyed during Cultural Revolution within those 10 years period. And you know, she cites one example. I was really kind of like shocked. It brought tears to my eyes. There is a monastery very close to Lhasa, which is, you know, the capital of Tibet. It's called Pempo. And so they burned the library of that monastery during the Cultural Revolution. So they burned all the books that the monastic community would use for reading and stuff like that. And then they had a huge collection of wooden wooden blocks. So they burned that for 3 weeks. So can you imagine that one library that belonged to one small monastery close to Lhasa was burned during the Cultural Revolution, and it lasted for 3 weeks. You know, like smoke was still coming from that library. So this is to just give you one extent of the destruction of, you know, Tibetan culture, Tibetan, artifacts that took place during Cultural Revolution.
So I'm going to bring us into what you are doing now in education. The Dalai Lama, when he came into India, one of the first things he set up was an education system. He was very adamant that in India, Tibetan would have their own school system. And I was reading recently that what they've been doing now with the younger children, because again, we've got so many generations removed living there, they learn Tibetan first. And they go through like the first 3 years, like up to 3rd grade, speaking Tibetan, reading Tibetan, doing everything Tibetan. Then they introduce English
Yeah.
and then they introduce another language, typically Hindu. But what are you doing on your side on the education? Because you just mentioned the library, the loss of that library is huge. And then you've got your Dalai Lama, who's the first thing he wants to put out there is an education system. And then that's what you've done. And you had the Fulbright Nehru Research Scholar that's when I first met you, actually. You were going over to India. June Pulcini, if you're out there, thank you for introducing me to him. You were going out there to research it and to study on it and to talk about the education system there. And what I find unique about that is in another country, we've got a whole different system for Tibetans to learn about their own schooling system. And we say we do that here with like our Native American reservations and some other areas, but for the most part, I don't know very many other countries that let another country come in as a host country and let them have their own schooling system, learn their own ways of speaking, writing, and their belief system, and then introduce them to the rest. So they're really indoctrinated Tibetan first. So speak to what you were doing with that.
Well, I think the first thing that His Holiness did when he took political asylum in India in early 1960s, he asked the then government of India to help establish Tibetan schools for Tibetan children, rather than sending all these Tibetan kids to existing Indian schools. He wanted separate schools for Tibetan children so they can learn Tibetan language, Tibetan history, Tibetan culture. And the government then was very gracious enough to really allow, these separate Tibetan schools to be established. Indian government established a separate, actually, office within the Indian government that would look after the education of Tibetan children in exile. Even I began to wonder as to why, this is such a unique, undertaking, unique experiment, you may call it, that was allowed to be taken place in India. And I think there are a lot of, should I say, factors that may have played into this. India had just regained freedom from the British Empire. So it was very fresh and was also trying to struggle and trying to survive and try to maintain their own culture and language. So they had this sort of like understanding of how, important to preserve one's own culture and language, because they lived under the British over 200 years. So everything was very fresh in their mind. They had just gotten freedom from British in 1947 very close to when Tibet was invaded by China. So it kind of like coincide. So that's really the Indian government and people had developed sort of like empathy, sensitivity to our situation. And then also, India at that time was really struggling with the language issues at that time. They could not impose one particular language at that time. And so somehow, they debated, they discussed, and they developed a very progressive language policy called three-language formula or framework. So this framework existed when Tibetans first, came into India. We were very fortunate. We were beneficiaries of three-language policy. So this three-language policy allowed you to learn your native or mother tongue language first, and then learn a regional language, and then so anyway, this language is really very is the one that allowed. Like if you go to India, has 22 recognized official languages,
wow.
And then over 4,000 dialects. India is one of the richest language diversity in the world. Really, honestly. But somehow this three-language framework has allowed all these languages to coexist. It's really an amazing language policy, language framework. And so the Tibetans actually benefited from this three-language policy. And now, and so we have several Tibetan schools where, Tibetan teachers, Indian teachers, they taught, different languages. And now, my research actually that end actually referred to, Tibetan schools actually initiated kind of like mother tongue based school language instruction in the early 1980s, which means Tibetan children would learn all the subjects in Tibetan language until they reach 6th grade. So when they get to the 6th grade, then the language of instruction is changed to English, because at the end of 10th or 12th grade, they have to give an exam in English language. I was really intrigued by this particular shift in the language of instruction situation in the Tibetan schools. And of course, in this country, we struggle with bilingual issues and English-only kind of issues. So, I was thinking, what can we learn from this Tibetan diaspora situation? And, so I studied and I went to, Tibetan classrooms, and I talked to the teachers and, in fact, engaged in classroom observation. And I wanted to know if the language proficiency that you develop in your native language or L1 or mother tongue really helps you to acquire the second language, in fact, more effectively and efficiently. And so, I was really interested in this, particularly in the 6th grade, when they change over the language of instruction. And so I wanted to know, what do these teachers do in the classroom in order to help Tibetan children to overcome this linguistic barrier? Because they're suddenly, like, for example, math instruction is now taking place in English. Science instruction taking place in English. Whereas until, 6th grade, they were taught everything in Tibetan language. So when I observed 6th grade, particularly this, transitional phase, I was really amazed. Whenever the teacher would resort to Tibetan language, kids would get the concept so quickly. Otherwise, language itself poses a struggle for them, a challenge. Forget about the understanding the concept in math, but the language itself becomes a problem. Am I right? So when the Tibetan teacher would say, "Oh, this is what it means in Tibetan language," they would get it right away. For example, in science, taproot, fibrous root, I still trying to recall. When the teacher would say, "What is a taproot?" They would be just scratching their head, and when he would say, "Oh, this is what it means in Tibetan language." Remember, like we had studied this in 5th grade. Then they would eyes would just sparkle, and they would just immediately get the concept. In math, for example, they were learning least common, some kind of LCM, some factor,
That's me. That's math.
and factor and decimal and all this stuff. They were teaching in English first, and then kids would be totally lost in the instruction in this in a different language. So as soon as the teacher would say, "Well, this means this in Tibetan language," remember, and then they get it. So I was really I then developed this firm belief that children must be provided with experiences to learn, to acquire as much language proficiency as possible in their native language first. And then, of course, they can eventually learn other things in English. So I really developed this firm sort of like belief in what we call in this country additive bilingual education. It is as if you are adding on to the repertoire of skills that you learn in one language, and then benefiting from it when you're acquiring the second language. And and really so that I had read a lot of things like that in bilingual education literature, but I had not observed, nor I really so this observation really led me to this conclusion that native language acquisition is very crucial in order for children to develop high levels of proficiency in the second language like English or German or French or whatever it is. So I became a very good kind of like a believer in that particular concept. It's called CUP, Common Underlying Proficiency. There's a misconception that one language hinders your ability to learn this, but not at all. This is really not true at all. It's a fallacy. Really, your high levels of efficiency in your native language, mother tongue, is an asset. It facilitates your ability to learn, math and science and stuff like that in the second language far more easily than if you were only, taught in one language, whereas your mother tongue was something else. And then children really struggle so much, because now they lose that touch with the family and things like that. So, yeah, I don't know whether I...
No, that's good, because the point of this talk is influential voices, and we like to bring out people who are just ordinary people doing extraordinary things, rather than the most famous person doing something. We like to bring apart just someone who's just like us, who's out there doing amazing stuff. And so with that, you brought that back, like the CUP system you're talking about, and you've been writing about it. And you were professor emeritus at Cal State Fullerton in elementary and bilingual. And you're utilizing this and bringing it back into the States for us to start learning different ways of working with the multi-languages, because we have multiple languages here.
Right.
And we have a lot of children that come to us speaking their first language, their mother tongue, and then we immediately change them. So they lose what they're starting off with, and then it's confusing for them to learn by. What you're noticing, what you're studying, is you keep them in that and then slowly bring in the other language. Is that what you do?
Right.
Yeah.
In the Tibetan tradition, it was a little bit different in the sense the Tibetan teachers speaking, 2-3 different languages, teaching to the Tibetan children in their own classrooms. So it's kind of like both the teacher and the taught are from the same cultural language background. So that was, it really is, we don't have that kind of luxury in this country. But what I tell teachers in this country is, at least celebrate different languages in your classroom. Send a positive message to all the children that whatever languages you speak, you are born with, is really is to be appreciated, is to be celebrated. It's a wonderful gift. And if you are able to at least convey that, then they will think, wow, I have a beautiful, mother tongue, and, they will develop interest to learn, like not necessarily in the public school, but from their parents or from somewhere else. So, we are not sending this negative message that, whatever language you bring is really like, negative and doesn't contribute to, So So I think, really when children really feel happy about their language background, about their racial background, about their, sexual orientation and whatnot, that really encourages them to engage in active learning, to engage in positive interactions with other children in the classroom, with the teacher, and a happy child, I think, is always someone who is interested in academic learning. If a child is unhappy because his language is being looked upon as negative, backward, and something that needs to be quickly, relinquished, whatever it is, then he or she is unhappy in the classroom. Can you imagine an unhappy child sitting in your classroom trying to learn math and science? It's impossible to get through his, emotional sort of trauma and emotional, should I say, disturbances. So I always encourage teachers, to develop this positive rapport with your children in the classroom. Even if you don't speak the language, even you're not familiar with the culture, at least try to, send this positive message to the children. So that, you don't,
give them the confidence.
Yeah,
it
gives them the confidence. So maybe since this topic is about how do we keep culture alive, and so now we have a lot of Tibetans living in this country, also in European countries, and Tibetans are scattered all over the world, really all over the world, and so an issue has become so important, and I think a lot of people are really worried. How do we maintain our cultural identity, language, religion, when your community is so dispersed all over the countries? Like in this country, for example, we have Tibetans living in San Francisco, Minnesota.
That's the diaspora.
Diaspora. Outside of India. In India, we have quite sizable Tibetan people living together. But Tibetans have now started to immigrate to the other countries. So really, it's become very important, particularly when Tibetan language culture is being destroyed in its own native land. It has become so important for the Tibetans in the diaspora to maintain Tibetan culture. And so now, on a happy note, I want to say, really, when you move away from your own cultural group, and familiar situations or context, you really try to develop more awareness and more eagerness to cherish and to maintain your culture and language. So I've seen this in the Tibetan diaspora in the United States. Our Tibetan children, not only do they go to the public school during the weekdays, they're busy with all stuff that we do in the public school, learning math, science, doing all kinds of stuff. And then weekends, they go to Tibetan schools, day school, Tibetan Sunday school type of situation. So, they more or less attend 2 different schools. Mm-hmm. And then, I'm sure you might be wondering, oh my God, this is huge burden for them. No, really, they seem to really enjoy this. In the public school, they're so happy, engaged in all these positive interactions with teachers and students and learning math and science. And they look forward to the weekend when they could go to a Tibetan school where they would learn Tibetan language, Tibetan, Tibetan songs, Tibetan, some recitations, things like that. So children are looking forward to this Sunday school rather than looking at as in one more school to go to. They eagerly look forward to this Sunday school situation. And what I have seen, based on my some casual observation, is, Tibetan children being in these 2 different school settings is actually so beneficial for them. Whatever they learn in the public school in terms of good study habits, it's being reinforced in the Sunday school. Whatever they learn in the Sunday school in Tibetan situation, good habits and, really, pay respect to the teachers and be attentive and stuff like that. They're able to utilize those experiences in the public school. And a lot of public school teachers, they really tend to kind of like appreciate that. because they say, they ask the Tibetan parents, how come your student, your child, it's so, studious, so hardworking and diligent and very positive and they say, well, my son or my daughter enjoys going to the, Sunday school, where they learn, they have a lot of fun. And, so that sort of like excitement, that enthusiasm is continued in the public school. It doesn't end in the Sunday school. So I think I find that really very hopeful that these children who are attending public schools in the United States or elsewhere in European countries, they are actively engaged. I've gone to many, I've given talks to some teachers, who would teach in the Sunday schools because they want to know what is a good, what are the effective teaching methods working with, with children who are learning multiple languages.
So in that, before we wrap it up, I just want to bring up that back in the 90s, there was a big Free Tibet movement.
Mm-hmm.
The actor Richard Gere was very famously out there speaking on behalf of Tibetans. Do you still see that, or do you feel like Tibetans just kind of getting forgotten in the social consciousness of people out there, or do you feel like there's still a strong wave and strong push?
Well, first of all, I would say Richard Gere is still very actively engaged in the Tibetan, movement.
To the detriment of his career, actually.
Yeah, I mean, he really sacrificed his career.
Yeah.
But he realized, the principle, to protect Tibetan culture is far more important. Recently, this NBA player, what's his name, Atnar, from Boston. I'm sure you can Google anyway. So you're right. In the 90s, there was a lot of interest. Beastie Boys. And,
Beastie Boys. Yeah.
There was a huge concert in San Francisco. So there is still a lot of interest, really, on the general American public, United States government. A lot of interest. They just recently passed many resolutions condemning China. China's continued sort of like excessive repression, suppression of Tibetan culture. I mean, it's still continuing. But really, what really changed is, China became economically more powerful in the 1990s because of our trade relationship with China.
Yeah.
We gave them free access. A lot of our factories, they moved to China and things. So when they become economically so powerful, they use that economic power to, for example, control media in this country, musicians in this country, and in Hollywood, for example, in this country.
The money backing.
They will say, well, if you support Tibet, we are going to not finance your movie project. So that has really done a lot of they use that to control. They do the same thing in Australia, in European countries. They use the economic power, to say you can't support Taiwan, for example, nor can you support Hong Kong people who are I mean, we have seen it. Hong Kong just crushed right in front of our own eyes. There wasn't a lot of outpouring of support. It was so sad because China used the economic power, and they use this, and it's really unfortunate.
We're gonna.
Okay, I'm back.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm back again.
Squeeze it.
So I'm squeezing in between you two.
We're a tight
between
couple.
You two. I know.
Thruple.
I love this. Thank you for joining us today, but don't go away yet. This is just a very short interlude. I'm Felicia Beardsley, Director of the Cultural Natural History Collections at the University, and I want to thank Nawang for joining us today and for being our influential voices speaker. Thank you so much. And a huge thank you to June Pulcini. This was her idea. This whole series was her brainstorm, and she provided the funding for it. So we really appreciate her more than you could ever know.
Thanks, June.
Also, thank you to Anne, who is our museum curator and our conversation guide today, to Randy Miller, who is our speaker coordinator, to Carla Rodriguez, who has been manning the computer. Gonzalez. Oh my gosh, Carla, I'm so sorry. How did I do that? And Annabelle Martinez. Did I get that right? Oh, thank you. Who has done a ton of work behind the scenes. She has been awesome. We're going to be hosting another Influential Voices dialogue in the fall. We don't know who we're going to invite yet, but it'll happen. And for those of you who are new to us, the Cultural Natural History Collections is the original museum for the university. We've been around for at least 130 years, and we still have the original collections, okay? So our collections are built from our students, alumni, community members. We are a working museum, and we are available for research by students, researchers, community members as well. But we exist solely on donations and soft money, so we would appreciate donations, should you think about it. But again, I want to thank you for joining us, and let's get to questions. I think Carla's been developed.
Before questions,
Okay.
we mentioned June Pulcini. She's an alumni of the University of Laverne from 1962. She also graciously loaned this to us today to use for this. Nawang, can you speak a little to this? 'Cause we got the dragon, we got the phoenix.
So the wool of this Tibetan rug actually came from Tibet. In the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of Tibetans living in exile in Nepal would go to Tibetan area and bring the wool to Nepal, where they would then hand spun and and then of course handmade these Tibetan rugs. And so June really wanted to support that kind of business, and so she bought several of these Tibetan rugs. They are all vegetable diet, means that no chemical has been
It's
used.
on natural dye.
Yeah, natural dye, and
Sheep wool?
sheep wool. Yes, sheep wool, and then we are really very lucky that June was willing to let go this this rug from her
As a loan.
living room. I know. I mean, for the time being, Randy and I kind of like rolled it up and brought here.
And then another thing, Dr. Clark, I see you in the audience here. We don't have any other Tibetan materials at the museum, but if anyone's ever interested, Bowers Museums has a really, really good collection.
Mm-hmm.
Let's open it up for questions. Okay, so the question is, can Nawang talk to his experience in supporting the Bowers Museum and an exhibit there?
It was in year 2000. I forget exactly, but Bowers was able to bring artifacts from the Potala collection from Tibet through some kind of very interesting diplomatic maneuver with the Chinese government. And so they brought about 200 different objects. And then they asked me to help them with kind of like writing the labels for those objects in English through some translation, and also I did the calligraphy for that Bowers Museum catalog. So my calligraphy still exists there. And then also they asked me to write a teacher's curriculum guide, so that when the teachers would come to Bowers Museum with the children, how do we integrate Tibetan art, for example, in your 6th grade or 7th grade, in conjunction with visual arts framework of California. So it's not like throwing in there right there, but
That's
so
right,
we
yeah.
developed very carefully, like what teachers could do in their own classrooms, to integrate Tibetan art as a part of a particular visual arts framework in the 3rd, 4th, whatever grade is. So I was involved with that. And really, Bowers was the first museum in this country, in fact, in all over the world, to be able to bring artifacts right from Tibet to showcase in the United States. And I always believed, although these art pieces were kind of like a lot of Tibetans would say, stolen from Tibet and things like that. But my perception, my thinking at that time was, I shouldn't be the one saying something about the art pieces. Let the art speak for themselves. I truly believed in the power of the art. I wanted the arts to invoke sentiments. And when children visit art, they see the art. They don't see
the
politics. No, they see, they appreciate the aesthetic beauty of each art piece. And so there was like His Holiness's drinking cup, a jade cup on a golden kind of like a stand. I still recall that. And then there was also the saddle that His Holiness used while riding his horse. So they brought the saddle too.
Wow.
And then of course there were a lot of beautiful Tibetan ladies' headdresses and ornaments, and a lot of ritual objects. It's so beautiful. And I still recall there was that statue of the king of Tibet, Songtsen Gampo, and his minister, Thumesam Buddha, who actually developed the Tibetan language in the 7th, 6th century. Those two statues, they really touched me. They made me cry. I touched them, I felt them, I looked at them, I said, oh my God, you're in the United States now, having left Tibet. And I also wondered what they would actually think of the situation of Tibet. I think they had, so it was kind of like, I really struggled with that. I was talking to the art pieces myself, so that was kind of like really very beautiful. I wrote kind of like an introductory to the curriculum guide, really very much expressing my own personal observation, how I felt when I saw the art pieces from Tibet, because I never thought I was going to see them.
Yeah.
Because China had totally blocked. Tibet became so isolated. We had no idea what was happening in Tibet. Honestly, I never thought I was going to meet my aunt, my relatives, and nor they had an idea whether I was alive or dead, or it was that sort of like total lack of communication, total lack of access to any kind of information from Tibet. We Tibetans in the exile lived about 30, 40 years.
So one more question.
Mm-hmm.
The comment for anyone who's interested, Bowers Museum is in Santa Ana in Orange County, California. And then let's have, by the way, shameless plug. The reason why they have those awesome objects is people donate to them. Okay, a question. So the question is about the weavers in Darshmala, that they've been affected. So what do you know about that? I'm sure that comes after the rug comment. And then the media with COVID, how has Tibet been affected by COVID?
Yes.
And that was Hillary that asked the question?
Yes.
I hope we got that right, Hillary.
Yeah, but the Tibetans are also like all of us in the same boat, really suffered a lot because of this COVID, which originated from China, unfortunately.
That's right.
And so they have suffered a lot. But at the same time, working with Indian counterpart, Indian health officials, I was very impressed. Tibetans have developed their own protocol for vaccination, and really, there's weekly reporting of like how many people got COVID positive, how many kind of like are still in the in the hospital. So there's like weekly update with regard to the COVID, vaccination, COVID patients, COVID, so that's
So
really,
medical was good for them. Basically they got through the COVID situation. It wasn't bad for the community.
No, the small Tibetan community actually suffered a lot. There has been a lot of death. Really, I don't know exactly how many, but they still, continue to, Tibetan, particularly in India, they continue to suffer. And the business, of course, has suffered a lot. Tibetans, they do kind of like small-scale business in India in order to survive on their livelihood. So all those things have suffered
So are there
a great deal.
weavers still doing traditional weaving?
But they still, yes, but
the natural dyes?
number has really gone down a lot because this kind of rug takes a long time, because each, what I call, they just make a knot.
So it's a knotted rug.
It's a knotted rug. Yeah, it's
So
not,
this isn't woven, it's knotted.
It's knotted.
That would take forever.
Yeah, so this hand knotting is a very special, quality and attribute of Tibetan rug making. There are very few, I think, in the world.
But isn't that typical with indigenous populations? They tend to, their culture, just the economics start off as like a tourism, if you will, because that's how they're going to start making the money when they're oppressed. And then eventually people start moving away, and then they start losing their trades and their skills because they're learning other skills. So do you think that's happening in Tibetan with Tibetan traditional skills like not weaving, but knotting a rug like this?
In India, I've actually seen, because we have a lot of Tibetans living in certain areas, this rug weaving is still very active.
Oh, okay.
It may have
There you go.
sort of like, gone down a little bit because of the COVID, because there was this social distancing. But right now, I believe it's picking up a little bit, like even in Nepal. And but of course, it's not really happening at the same rate as it used to be once upon a time, when there was a very robust rug business all over the world. But now, even Tibetan rug making business has gone down significantly.
Yeah, there was a big rug
Not only due to COVID, but due to economic pressure from mainland China. They kind of like produce their own version of carpets. And so they flooded the world market with their own version of, so poor Tibetans, like they can't compete. So, but there are very few outlets for Tibetan rugs in this country and elsewhere.
Does anyone in the audience have a question before we wrap up? Hello.
Thank you for coming here and your presentation. What I've read about Dalai Lama, I admire him very much. My question is does the Indian government allow Dalai Lama to do political campaign and things of that nature for going back home? And secondly, do you also foresee Dalai Lama and China getting together finally and for him to return to Tibet?
Great question. Let me repeat it. So the question is, I already forgot it. Do you see that Tibetan and China coming back together, like Tibet going back to China? And then is the Dalai Lama involved in politics?
To get involved in politics?
Yeah. Great question, because we didn't get to that point where we have stuff of that.
I mean, we have Tibetan government in exile in India. Dalai Lama used to be the head of that till about 2011 or something. When he gave up his temporal sort of like, leadership, he said, I'm going to retire and, just, engage in spiritual practices. So now we have elected Tibetan, officials who run the Tibetan exile government in India. And so I'm sure there is some kind of like tacit understanding between Tibetans and the Indian government, because the Indian government allows them, to operate in India. But I don't know exactly how, and it is in the interest of, Indian government there's some resolution that takes place between, Tibetans and the Chinese, and even His Holiness is very eager to visit Tibet. I mean, honestly, Tibetans in Tibet are that actually they are kind of like setting themselves on fire, as a way to bring attention to their deepest feeling of seeing His Holiness in person in Tibet once before they die. And so there is that, His Holiness, I'm sure, understands that. So he has this keen interest to go back to, but China is still proving to be a very difficult country to deal with. And I think they are a little bit afraid that once His Holiness comes to Tibet or China, the floodgate is going to be open. His Holiness is so, popular, even in China, although China is trying to, kind of like, doesn't allow you to carry a photo of His Holiness, or even if you celebrate his birthday, you can be jailed, you can be imprisoned. Really.
Is it mostly a religion and cultural revolution part, or is it some other factors that are involved between the conflict between Dalai Lama and China?
So is it a culture and religion issue that causes the war between China and Dalai Lama, or do you think it's something else?
I think it's many things, really. It can't be that simplistic, but culture, politics, resources, and then China's interest to control the strategic.
I was just going to add into that. You've got also the Dalai Lama's up in age. Is he 87?
87, yeah.
So he's 87 now, and the new Dalai Lama should be chosen. China owns the golden urn from which they choose the next Dalai Lama. But the Dalai Lama recently in 2019 was saying he's been in exile for so long in India, he thinks that the Dalai Lama might come out of India and not China. So there's an issue right now, and I might be overstepping boundaries here, but it seems to me if China can control who the next Dalai Lama is, then they could control that race inside of their country. But if the Dalai Lama is chosen out of India, then they don't have that control again over the spiritual leader.
Yes. So, the choosing of Dalai Lama is actually a spiritual practice. So it's really very absurd for the Chinese government to kind of like, take this spiritual practice route when the government itself is atheist.
Yeah.
They don't believe in any religion.
There's irony.
But when it comes to the fact that if the religion benefits them, they will then say, oh, okay. Now, for example, recently they introduced something called Tibetan Buddhism with Chinese socialist characteristics. What an absurd kind of like, combination or blending.
Yeah.
And so, but
that's
anyway,
right.
the good news is the United States government recently passed a resolution saying that the choosing of the next Dalai Lama is absolutely his right, personal right, as well as the right of the Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. China should not have anything to say with regard to the next, reincarnation of Dalai Lama. In case they go that route, United States government is going to impose very serious sanctions of all kinds. Anyway, that's really a wonderful, welcoming news for us in the exiled community that United States government is truly behind us with regard to the reincarnation of His Holiness.
Thank you for your response. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the great question, because we were going to talk about that. We didn't go there. And we're wrapping it up. So we bring back Felicia.
Me. Oh,
I don't know did you introduce yourself?
I did.
Okay, go.
I did.
She is the boss.
Like, okay, go.
I'm the boss okay. Of everybody. But okay, this concludes our program today. So once again, thank you, Nawang. Thank you, Anne. This has been an incredible experience, a beautiful conversation. I've learned so much. So thank you for joining us on Influential Voices.
Interesting conversation.
Yes. So with that, we are concluding. Hope everybody is safe out there. Thank you for joining us.